Hello everyone, I'm Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary concepts and more to help you become a literary expert. So in today's video, we're reading one of my favourite poems of all time, and it's a poem that's considered to be a landmark document in literary modernism. And it's T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which is a 140-line dramatic monologue about, among many other things, what it looks and feels like to live with regret, longing, and fear about never realizing one's full potential. So I remember first reading this poem for my modernist literature course at university, and even though I didn't really understand much or really any of it back then, over the years I find myself occasionally returning to reading Prufrock whenever I feel like I want some introspection, especially in times when life seems to pose too many questions that I can't really answer, or whenever I'm just feeling a little bit down in the dumps. So for some reason, despite the poem's intellectually taxing nature, the poem also has the magic of somehow always providing me with some emotional balm, because it speaks to some sort of deeper part in my soul, I guess, as woo-woo as that sounds. So many scholars have lionized this poem as the sort of quintessential ode to the so-called modern condition, which really broadly refers to the zeitgeist of the early 20th century, when the Western world, after a period of tremendous prosperity and growth in the 19th century, felt an overwhelming sense of existential loss, directionlessness, and confusion about where the world was headed with the pivot into the 1900s. So a great historical irony about this poem is that Eliot had written it in 1911, but by the time it was first published in 1915, the First World War, as you'll know, had already broken out, which makes the phrase halfway into the poem, "the strength to force the moment to its crisis," seem all the more poignant. 1914 being the year when the world order turned topsy-turvy was quite literally forced to a crisis. So while Prufrock the speaker may claim that I am no prophet, it appears that history had eventually proven him, or rather, of course, T.S. Eliot the poet, tragically. But anyway, there's an incredible amount to unpack about this beautiful and complex poem, which is exactly what I'll try to do in the rest of this video. So since this is a fairly long poem, I'll be walking us through each stanza by dividing the poem up into 4 sections. So buckle up for what's hopefully going to be an interesting journey into a quirky but very familiar psyche, because I suspect that we are all, in some way, Prufrock himself. Now, like many modernist writers, Eliot has a reputation for being difficult and pretentious. And this is partly because of his elusiveness, i.e., Eliot likes to go a bit crazy with the intertextual references, many of which can be obscure, highbrow, and sourced from canonical literary works that most people just won't really bother reading, like the Bible, Shakespeare, Homer, Dante, etc. Or at least not cover to cover. So while there's certainly a psychology of intellectual flexing going on, part of why Eliot wrote like this might have just been a function of his academic education. At the time when Eliot was writing Prufrock, he was a doctorate student at Harvard after having already done a BA there, and was apparently nose-deep in Greek, Latin, German, Italian literature, Sanskrit, Indian philosophy, what have you. So he was all over the place and very much locked in, though, in a hyper-academic environment, which would inevitably have translated into the style of Prufrock and many of his other poems, as we can tell right off the bat with the Italian Epigraph from Dante's Inferno, Canto 27, as I'll show below. Now, the context for this epigraph refers to a damned soul in hell named Guido da Montefeltro, who in the scene is confiding in Dante, the narrator. Guido thinks that Dante is a fellow damned soul who won't ever return to the earth to expose his sins, but he doesn't know that Dante is actually just a passing visitor and will indeed return to the world of the living to tell the story. This mode of address hints at the rest of the dramatic monologue as also being a sort of confession, and implicates the reader as Prufrock's confidant. But by shrouding the message of this confessionalism in the original Italian language, Eliot reinforces a sense of coded secrecy, of one wanting to hide behind the artifice of erudition as a way to temper deeper feelings of shame, fear, and guilt, which are often central to a confession. And this impulse, as we'll go on to see from the rest of the poem, is very much central to Prufrock's psyche. So stanza 1 begins with a curious imperative. Let us go then, you and I, which sounds like both an invitation and a command. The phrase let us go is repeated thrice throughout the rest of the stanza, which makes it sound like Prufrock is trying to convince a reluctant companion. And perhaps for good reason too, because the scene that Eliot then sets for the journey ahead isn't exactly idyllic or pleasant. It begins with the jarring, clinical, and unpoetic juxtaposition of the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table, with the word etherized suggesting a desire of numbness as relief from pain. Now, elsewhere in the stanza, the overall imagery speaks of decay, fatigue, and abandonment, with the certain half-deserted streets, muttering retreats, one-night cheap hotels, oyster shells, and tedious argument, all pointing to a listless, languid disposition, as if Prufrock finds everything to be hollow and weary. This dreariness is enacted as well by the syntactical seesawing of the short let us go versus the enjambed, the muttering retreats of restless nights, etc., etc., up to the word oyster shells, and also streets that follow, etc., etc., down to the word question, with these lines limping into the next and dragging up to that overwhelming question which we're not supposed to ask. But despite the half-hearted, unfinished paths and activities that pepper this stanza, Prufrock's last line, let us go and make our visit, suggests a strong desire to find answers and seek closure. So what do we make of the refrain of stanzas 2 and 5? In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. Now, it seems like a strange interpolation, especially with the highbrow allusion to the great Florentine artist Michelangelo coming right after such an unromantic, seedy vignette in stanza 1. But perhaps its meaning would only make sense in retrospect after we're done reading the entire poem. Now, one of Prufrock's main obsessions, as we'll go on to see, is this notion that he gave up his chance at greatness in life. Deep down, Prufrock suspects that he could have been a great man, but inaction and cowardice held him back. And by the time he's giving this speech, it's already a bit too late. Michelangelo, as this quintessential representative of a polymathic genius, perhaps symbolizes the kind of ideal that Prufrock would have liked to become. That he hears it as women talking of Michelangelo, not him, activates his masculine shame, as we later find out that Prufrock suffers and believes himself to be the victim of ongoing rejection from the opposite sex, which he perceives his lack of greatness to be partly a cause of. And these female voices chatting about Michelangelo then strengthens the fabric of narrative self-consciousness in the poem. As stanza 3 shifts back to the broader environment, the entrance of the numinous yellow fog and yellow smoke builds on the atmospheric decay. Eliot uses the technique of zoomorphism to characterize this yellow presence as a sly cat, ascribing to the fog and shadow feline actions as it rubs its back and muzzle upon on the window panes, licked its tongue, lingered upon the pools. And these are slow, seductive movements, but the description takes us by surprise as we see a succession of sharper, energetic actions as the fog cat slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and curled once about the house before finally falling asleep. Now, this contrast between lingering and pouncing, slowness and quickness, laxness and levity parallels what we'll soon discover to be the tension at the heart of Prufrock's existential agony. Because Prufrock is a man who lingers, dallies, licks at corners to peek at bigger possibilities in life, but whenever he tries to make that leap, he retreats back into the metaphorical house of his ego and sleeps away the fear of taking that step into the unknown and potentially into greatness. But Prufrock is painfully aware of his cowardice, which is why he must seek a means to self-soothe. And stanza 4 is his excuse. There will be time, he reassures himself, for the unrealized greatness that he so desires but still cannot somehow bring himself to achieve. For a moment, Prufrock projects a future where he's a politician to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet, or an artist to murder and create, or a philosopher, all the works and days of hands that lift and drop a question on your plate, or indeed, somewhat self-reflexively, for T.S. Eliot himself, a writer who must undergo 100 indecisions, 100 visions and revisions of a draft that always seems to need polishing, refining, and perfecting. By the way, guys, if you find this video helpful so far, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss out on any of my top grade lit study content going forward. I'd also encourage you to check out my membership program by clicking the join button below if you want exclusive access to members only study content and make special video requests. I'll see you there. But what's curious is that he uses the second person pronoun you in this sequence of future projection, not I, despite the desire to become all of these impressive figures clearly being his, Prufrock's. Now, this vague you pronoun could be his imaginary companion or the reader, but more tellingly, by externalizing his own frustrated goals onto another subject outside of himself, Prufrock reveals the evasive impulse that underlies and, more crucially, hampers his pursuit of ambition. His self-identity cowers at the thought of possibly taking on these momentous tasks that great people must shoulder. Hence his retreat back into the humdrum rhythms of comforting mundanity, encapsulated in the last line of the stanza in the neat triple alliteration and prim domestic imagery of before the taking of a toast and tea, because of course that is much more comforting, albeit in the short term. Now, as the poem moves into stanza 6, Prufrock's impulse to delay continues to manifest as rumination, as he wonders, do I dare and do I dare? Now, I personally think that this overwhelming question that is never explicitly spelt out in this poem is, in fact, do I dare? Because it's so fundamental to the emotional and thematic essence of Prufrock's dilemma. His lack of daring is the root cause of his lack of achievement, which he'll later acknowledge in what's arguably the most poignant but also most forthcoming line in the poem, and in short, I was afraid. But what is the reason for Prufrock's crippling fear and continuous need to retreat and turn back and descend the stair of ambition? Now, one possible reason is his fear of social judgment, which is reflected in the Greek chorus-like commentary of they will say, how his hair is growing thin, and they will say, but how his arms and legs are thin. The thing about these remarks, though, is that they are Prufrock's imaginations, fed by no other than self-conscious shame over his middle age and physical frailty, which are inherent traits that Prufrock attempts to cover up with proper gentlemanly attire of my morning coat, my collar mounting firmly to the chin, my necktie rich and modest, but which ultimately cannot instill in him true confidence to dare disturb the universe. Now, the Stoic Greek philosopher Seneca's wisdom comes to mind here. He says, we suffer more in imagination than in reality, which captures here the nature of Prufrock's self-conscious, self-deprecating suffering. There's also an interesting point to make about the form of lines 45 to 48, which are arranged in an interestingly descending staircase-like shape. Now, apart from being a witty visual echo to the earlier reference of descend the stair in line 39, this downward graphical arrangement may draw us back to the Dantean epigram at the start, which we'll recall comes from inferno, which means hell. Now, thinking in biblical metaphors, there is only one destination for a descending stairwell, which is, of course, hell. So, does constant delaying and procrastination on important matters in life lead eventually to the underworld? Or is the implication that a life so steeped in fear and cowardice is really no different from a hellish, sinful existence? Either way, the darker hints in the structure here reveal that Prufrock's mind is really much more troubled than his surface flippant tone seems to let on. Now, with the turn into stanzas 7 and 9, it seems that Prufrock's mind travels back to a former life. And here it might be helpful to draw on Eliot's own personal experiences at the point when he was writing this poem. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, the poet had composed Prufrock during his Harvard doctorate years, and one could read the descriptions in these 3 stanzas to be vignettes of his campus life at Harvard, but refrain from the retrospective point of view of a middle-aged man who is reminiscing on his youth. Those voices dying with a dying fall might be the monotonous voice of a dull university lecturer droning on about those dying subjects, like Latin and Greek, for example, coupled with sharp eyes that fix you in a formulated phrase. And this formulated phrase might refer to stuffy jargon, as the student becomes distracted by the music from a farther room, possibly symbolizing visions of a more interesting, free life beyond the academic confines, but one that was never really explored. There's also the wistful collection of a library crush that he never really approached but had subjected to his voyeuristic gaze, with arms that are braceleted and white and bare, downed with light brown hair that lie along a table, and perfume from a dress that makes me so digress. And of course there's a hint of sexualization here as well, which perhaps adds to a little bit of the sort of voyeuristic undertone. Now note the 3 enveloping refrains that contain these memories though, where Prufrock, with an air of smug resignation, claims that, "For and I have known them all already, known them all," but then concluding those unexplored opportunities and unpursued relationships with a self-righteous rhetorical question, "So how should I presume?" Implication being that, well, should I have presumed that life outside of academia and the girl I never had the guts to talk to might have led to something more? He seems to ask, but with a hint of defensiveness. But the subtext is that Prufrock was too embarrassed or clueless or indeed fearful to take any of these risks, and this honesty comes to bear with the question, and how should I begin, even though it is too late? This need for external reassurance is also shown when he asks, "Shall I say, with the wistful image of smoke that rises from the pipes of lonely men in shirt sleeves leaning out of windows, potentially symbolizing dreams extinguished," as the narrative perspective fast forwards from a recollection of him as a young, dreamy intellectual to a melancholic acknowledgement of his present state, being one example of these many lonely men. Realizing that he now cuts a sad, solitary figure, Prufrock deflects with a humorous metaphor his deep sense of shame and defeat by comparing himself to a crab. "I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas." For a man like Prufrock, it seems that a life consigned to absolute anonymity, and most importantly, a lack of consciousness about one's pitiful anonymity, which is what a crab would have, might really make living a less painful affair. What you don't know won't hurt you. But by this point, the central tension between Prufrock's ideal as a great man and his reality as a mundane everyman is established. Yet as he continues to reflect on what sort of greatness he hopes to have achieved, Prufrock is forced to confront the singular reason for why he had let the moment of his greatness flicker. "And in short, I was afraid," he says. Fear is Prufrock's albatross. So for a poem that is so notoriously dense and difficult, Love Song embodies an incredibly simple, human, and relatable message, which is that, like Prufrock, we miss out on opportunities that set us apart from the herd because we cannot imagine ourselves to be anything other than ordinary. The pedestrian and homely routine of tea and cakes and ices, the cups, the marmalade, the tea, the porcelain, and the mindless chatter of some talk of you and me all seem much more comforting and familiar in the moment. But as Prufrock looks back on the time lost, he questions if it would have been worth it after all. Would it have been worthwhile to settle for an inconsequential existence just to avoid the necessary pain and uncertainty of daring to be special, of swallowing self-consciousness with indifference, to have bitten off the matter with a smile, to have squeezed the universe into a ball, and to roll it towards some overwhelming question, which is a question which doesn't offer easy and immediate answer. Now note that the allusions in stanza 13 and 14 point to examples of awe-inspiring biblical figures, such as John the Baptist, who was a prophet known for being a precursor to Christ and was beheaded with his head brought in upon a platter, as well as Lazarus, who was the figure resurrected by Jesus 4 days after his death. But perhaps the more important point is that Prufrock says he does not see himself in the light of these incredible men, because he either can't fathom obtaining this degree of significance, or is implying that the significance that he'd be content with doesn't even have to reach such tremendous proportions. These men are not what I meant at all. That is not it at all, he says. Because greatness to him doesn't even have to mean being a religious prophet or the subject of superhuman miracle that has to go down in history. It can be much more tempered, and yet even still, he couldn't bring himself to throw off ashore or turn towards the window, which may be read as symbolic gestures of just letting go of fear, ego, and embracing the risky path of pursuing something more. Now, as the poem reaches its final section, Prufrock's sense of self further disintegrates, with his regret over lost time culminating in confusion, self-doubt, and an unresolved longing for deep desires that he can only indulge in through fantasy. There's the famous Shakespearean allusions to Hamlet, Polonius, and the Fool, which is Falstaff in the history plays, beginning with his cry, "No, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be." The irony here, though, is that while Prufrock is certainly no prince, he does possess the same set of human traits that Hamlet the man exhibits in Shakespeare's play, with both characters being victims of their own hesitation, inaction, and philosophizing impulse that ultimately paralyzes their chance at meaningful progress. Prufrock in particular is hobbled by his self-deprecating obsession, minimizing himself as a deferential, almost ridiculous tool who will only ever play second fiddle to another great man. Yet his ego remains big enough for him to package his identity with intellectualized polysyllabic diction, calling himself politic, cautious, and meticulous, full of high sentence but a bit obtuse. Perhaps the throbbing caesura-peppered rhythm of, at times, indeed, almost ridiculous, almost at times, the fool, mirrors his pathological hesitation as a man who can only take these puny, tiny steps, but never having the courage to venture beyond with big leaps in life. The last couple of stanzas are especially interesting for the contrast in tone and mood. On the one hand, the sequence of end rhymes conveys a feeling of lightness, as if Prufrock has, through confiding in us, the readers, his private emotional world, gained some measure of catharsis and unburdened himself from the regret of what could have been. But while there's a touch of humour in the whimsical, pitiful image of him wearing the bottoms of my trousers rolled, the comically mismatched juxtaposition of "Do I dare eat a peach?" and the romantic lyricism of him wearing white flannel trousers, walking upon the beach to have heard the mermaids singing each to each, it all falls with a pathetic thud, with the plain disappointing statement of, "I do not think they will sing to me." So in his mind, Prufrock has already rejected himself out of self-consciousness over his insecurities, as he laments that, I grow old, which refutes, actually, his earlier insistence that there will be time. And Prufrock also imagines looking out at the singing mermaids and seagulls whom he fantasizes, but perhaps also envies for their freedom and beauty, which are qualities that he wishes he himself possessed. The last line, "Till human voices wake us and we drown," may seem paradoxical, because waking up normally implies facing up to life, instead of drowning with the risk of death. Yet the implication here, of course, is that for Prufrock, continuing to live and to recognize the truth of his reality is what drowns him in this indefinite, suboptimal state of a deadening existence. To Prufrock, he's let his moment of greatness flicker and pass by, and he's finally come to a sobering realization that his future is bleak. Yet notice that he transitions from the singular I pronoun to the collective we in the final stanza, which in a way turns his individual plight into a general commentary, if not caution, on the human condition, which could apply not just to him, but also to each one of us. Phew! And there you go, guys. That's my extensive analysis on this wonderful, wonderful, multi-layered poem. It's a work of lyrical sadness, of human complexity, of regret, fear, desire, and unfulfilled ambition. And no matter how many times I read Love Song, I can always find some nugget of wisdom or seek some degree of emotional solace in it. But anyway, I hope my analysis has shown you that there is no need to fear Eliot's elusiveness or supposed difficulty, because at its core, his poem speaks to us on a much more human and relatable level. So for your next video, I recommend that you watch my overview of the context of modernist literature, which is going to give you a good starting framework to read other modernist works like this one, Love Song. And you can check that out right here. So make sure you also hit the thumbs up button below so you can encourage me to keep making these useful lit study videos for you and other passionate lit learners all around the world. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel and hit that bell notification so you never miss out on my weekly videos going forward. You can also consider joining my membership program for exclusive video requests and essay review perks. And check that out in the description box below. And I will see you, as always, in the next one.